dip quickly after sunset. There'll be a west-east split across Scotland this evening, with dry and sunny weather for eastern areas and cloudy conditions in the west with a little rain possible. Patchy cloud and sunny spells across Northern Ireland, but thicker cloud and rain also approaching from the west throughout the evening. The winds will increase too. Cloud, rain and stronger winds will edge in from the west overnight, the rain turning heavy at times over western hills. And that's how the weather's shaping up overnight into tomorrow morning.
Join me, Nana Akua, on Fridays, Saturdays and Sunday afternoons here on GB News. Expect fiery debate and passionate discussion as my panel and I take on some of the top stories hitting the headlines.
You can look up the statistics.
No, you look it up. I hug everyone. We learn from it and try and move on. That's it. Opinion is at the heart of the show. It's a place for open and frank conversation, but without the fear of cancellation. So join me here on GB News on Friday, Saturday and Sunday afternoons between 4 and 6 p.m.
GB News is the UK's home of discussion and debate
From all perspectives.
To stay up to date on the latest stories,
Make sure that you subscribe to the GB News channel.
right here on YouTube.
You can watch us live 24/7 across the whole world.
You can also check out exclusive content and catch up on previous episodes of your favourite shows.
Every day, we ask the questions
That you'd ask, so why not add your voice to the conversation in the comments section?
Don't forget to subscribe. We are GB News, Britain's news channel.
Every night at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before. Basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is
Headliners, the paper review show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon.
And Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Good afternoon. You're watching The Discussion with me, Inaya Folarin Iman, where we discuss the big moral, cultural and political questions of our time. We've got a packed show for you this afternoon. Were the truckers' protests in Canada an example of class war? And who bears responsibility for the conflict in Ukraine? All that coming up and much more across the programme. But first, here's the bulletins.
Good afternoon. It's 3 o'clock. I'm Rhiannon Jones in the GB newsroom. Ukrainian and Russian officials will meet for talks. That's according to President Zelensky's office. It said negotiations will take place, and they'll take place on the border between Belarus and Ukraine without preconditions. The Ukrainian president had said this morning that he's ready for peace talks with Russia, just not in Belarus, as it served as a staging ground for the invasion. Ukraine's foreign minister says Belarus has given assurance that it won't get involved in the war during the talks. The Ukraine's presidential advisor said it's currently quiet across the country. President Putin's order to raise nuclear deterrent forces to high alert is dangerous rhetoric and irresponsible behaviour. That's according to NATO's chief Jens Stoltenberg. The White House says it's part of Moscow's pattern of manufacturing threats. Chair of the Commons Defence Select Committee, Tobias Ellwood, says the Russian timetable is not working and that Putin is trying to intimidate the West.
Perhaps in a sense of almost panic by Putin in suggesting it's now firstly time for talks. That seems a bit premature given that it's only day 4, and now almost referencing the nuclear deterrent as if to somehow get us to become rattled, to intimidate us and so forth. We need to stand firm. We need to hold our ground.
Kharkiv's governor says Ukraine is still in full control of its second largest city after Russian forces entered early this morning. Intensive rocket artillery exchanges overnight have been followed by heavy fighting in the area. The Ukrainian president announced the country is setting up a foreign legion to bring in volunteers from abroad. Volodymyr Zelensky said the night had been brutal with shelling of civilian buildings.
They are fighting against everyone. They are fighting against all living beings, against kindergartens, residential buildings, against ambulances. They use rocket artillery, missiles in city districts where there are not, and never were, any military facilities.
President Zelensky there. He also said Ukrainian forces had held off Russian troops advancing on the capital. That as the mayor of Kiev confirmed there are no Russian troops in his city. Vitaly Klitschko said that in total 31 people had died in the capital since the attack started, including 9 civilians, while 106 people have been injured. 368,000 Ukrainians have already fled for Poland, Moldova and other neighbouring countries. The United Nations is warning the number could grow to 4 million if fighting escalates further. Prime Minister Boris Johnson's confirmed the UK will take refugees fleeing the war. The Deputy Defence Minister for Ukraine says Russia has lost around 4,300 men so far, as well as 146 tanks and 26 helicopters. Irina Desipio is the president of the Revived Soldiers of Ukraine, a US charity organising aid. She told GB News of her parents who fled Ukraine to Poland and how her brother's defending his country. She says Ukrainians are fighting with their bare hands and the invasion will incur big Russian losses.
Our privilege is that we know territory. We own our land. We know every corner. We know every house. So for Russians, it's much harder to come in and fight. That's why they're losing a lot of people. I can't believe Putin sending his own people to die, because they will die.
Back here, police forces in England and Wales have recorded the highest numbers of rapes since Sarah Everard's murder almost a year ago. The Office for National Statistics also recorded the second highest number of sexual offences since April last year. Ms Everard was killed by serving Met police officer Wayne Couzens in South London in March last year. And rail firms are ramping up services that had been cancelled due to COVID. Avanti West Coast and East Midlands Railway are bringing back lines cut in December and January. For those coming to London, North Wales and Chester will get a second daily service to and from the capital. And trains from Manchester and Birmingham to Euston will be doubled from Monday. This is GB News. We'll bring you more as it happens, but now let's go back to Inaya and this discussion.
Thank you, Rhiannon, and welcome back to the discussion. Well, on Wednesday, Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau revoked the emergency powers used to dislodge trucker-led protests in Ottawa and blockades of border crossings to the United States as he declared the crisis over. The protest began as a revolt against vaccine mandates in January that required unvaccinated truckers to get the jab or to isolate for 2 weeks each time they crossed the US border. But the protests came to signify much more than that. Reception of the protest has taken 2 main lines. The so-called Liberal side, voiced by Trudeau, has dismissed the truckers as selfish, anti-truth, conspiracy theorists, and even transphobes. But others defend the truckers, saying that the protests were a legitimate act of civil disobedience in order to bring attention to concerns over material questions of freedom, workers' rights, and unchecked growing state power. One argument is that the truckers' protest and its receptions reveal new class dynamics and relations forming, such as the divide between the largely virtual managerial elite and the physically rooted working class. Well, to unpick this, I am delighted to be joined by Michael Lind, academic and author of The New Class War, Saving Democracy from the Managerial Elite. Thank you for joining me this afternoon. Firstly, I just want to ask, what did you make of the truckers' dispute that unfolded in Canada over the last few weeks?
Well, it reminded me very much of the Gilets jaunes, the yellow jackets, a few years ago in France. And in both cases, you had a policy that imposed minimal costs on the so-called laptop classes, the professional classes. In the case of France, it was a diesel fuel tax. It was a COVID mandate in the case of the truckers. And in both cases, the cost fell heavily on people involved in the physical world who relied on transportation. This was, to some degree, whatever the merits of the cases, a clash between the working class and the professional managerial elite with college educations.
What do you make of some of the response, as I mentioned in the introduction? It seems to be a running theme now when we see working class organising. They're often accused of being bigots and racists and all sorts of isms and obes. I mean, this is a running theme. What do you make of that kind of response?
Well, the modern center-left in the United States and to some degree in Western Europe emerged in the Civil Rights Revolution, and it replaced an older left that was based on the working classes in Western Europe and in North America. So the imagery of the modern center-left, whose social base consists now of fairly affluent college-educated professionals, it defines its opponents in terms of segregationists and in terms of racist Nazis and fascists. It's a false characterization of many working class people. There's now a multiracial working class in the U.S. and Western Europe. What we have seen in the last 3 elections in the U.S. is a shift towards the Republicans of Hispanics and even of African Americans as educational polarization and class polarization are replacing racial polarization.
And can Trudeau really be called liberal? Because as I said in the introduction, so-called liberal, but it does sometimes seem that we need new labels to understand the way in which society and economic relations has changed. Because when we have people that are described as liberal, demanding and arguing for many repressive policies, I mean, the act that was invoked by Trudeau was a never used before law. I mean, do you really think the word liberal captures that type of politics? Or perhaps we need to understand things and describe things in a different way?
I agree entirely. In my book, The New Class War, Saving Democracy from the Managerial Elite, I describe that particular faction as technocratic neoliberals. Another way to put it is that the emerging divide in Western societies is not between left and right. It's between insiders and outsiders. The insiders tend to be the college-educated professionals and managers with affluent incomes and assets. The outsiders are the working classes of all races.
And on that same point that you made about a kind of multi-ethnic working class, and I think we saw that when it came to the Trump vote. Surprisingly, he actually increased his vote share amongst many ethnic minority groups. I mean, who would you say really represents the working class now? Do you think that it is a populist movement, populist leaders, or are other forces more representative or better vehicles for working class people to organise for their own interests?
I don't think anybody really represents most working class people of all races at this point. In the past, the trade unions did that effectively. Sometimes they were corrupt and abusive, but they did represent their constituents. Right now, we have both parties, right and left, tend to be dominated by big money donors and staffed by college-educated professionals. So this creates a vacuum of representation for working class people, which demagogues like Donald Trump can fill. And they may be sincere, they may be insincere, but they tend to be ineffectual because you get a cult of personality around an outsider populist politician instead of the kind of organized muscle that organized labor used to represent.
And just broadening this out a bit, in terms of that question about whether or not these labels still mean something and these changing economic and social dynamics within Western societies, we are right now obviously seeing quite shockingly the kind of conflict going on in Ukraine. And there has been questions about whether or not the West is still coherent as a moral force on the international stage. I mean, do you think some of these illiberal dynamics and conflicts internally within Western societies are actually making it much more difficult for them to respond to problems internationally in a coherent way?
Well, I do think you see a class divide in enthusiasm for military intervention, whether it's in Ukraine or Afghanistan or anywhere else. Since the abolition of the draft, Western societies have had professional militaries, which are made up largely of working class men and women. And if you look at American polls, the working class, whose family members are much more likely to be in harm's way in the military, are much more skeptical about military intervention. They're not isolationist, but they're much more wary of getting into wars than what is sometimes called the laptop class. And we're seeing this divide over Ukraine. If you look at the pundits and the opinion leaders, they're overwhelmingly very hawkish on responding to Putin, rightly so maybe. But a recent poll showed that 50% of Americans wanted the U.S. to play only a minor role in the conflict, and 20% wanted the U.S. to have no role at all. So here again, as in these other issues, where the costs fall heavily on the working class rather than on the elite, you get a divide in opinions towards public policy.
Well, thank you so much for joining me this afternoon, Michael Lind, academic and author of The New Class War, Saving Democracy from the Managerial Elite. And we will be covering these new dynamics that are forming over the last few years more on this show. Now, of course, as I mentioned, the Russian invasion of Ukraine is the focus of the international community right now, and we'll be revisiting this subject throughout the show and to examine the situation from a wide range of perspectives. Did the invasion catch Western political leaders by surprise? What are the motivations, ambitions and aspirations of the Russian regime? And what responsibility, if any, does the West have for the unfolding situation? And also, as Germany has announced that it will be spending above 2% of GDP on defence, are Western countries rethinking their position on the world stage? Well, joining me now to discuss this is Dr. Remi Adekoya, politics lecturer at the University of York. Thank you so much for joining me this afternoon, Dr. Adekoya. First, I just want to start with, what is your reaction, very briefly, to the conflict unfolding in Ukraine right now?
Well, there's obviously, first of all, the human reaction. Seeing people die on the streets is terrible, and one just wants the war to end as quickly as possible, obviously. That's the human reaction. If we're talking about the big picture reaction, then I do think we need to start thinking beyond how the world, we need to start thinking about how the world is going to look after this war is over, because it is probably going to be over probably not too long. We heard today there's going to be talks between the Ukrainian delegation and a Russian delegation. And so we'll see how that works out. But this is a big picture game. This is not just about Ukraine. And even if you read UK defense documents from 2021, they predicted this was going to happen. And generally speaking, we are living in a world right now where there's, the global distribution of power is changing. And this means there are countries which want to have more of a say in how the world is run. And there are countries which want to rewrite the security architecture of the world. And we're just going to have to be ready to deal with that.
On that point in having to be ready to deal with that, I mean, do you think that the West should be playing a more significant role? There's some that argue that we should not get involved at all. Others arguing that we need to be putting forward much stronger kind of financial sanctions, so to speak, on Russia. And many are perhaps even arguing that perhaps the expansion into NATO, from NATO into the eastern region, may bear some responsibility. I mean, where do you see the West's position and seating right now in what's going on?
Right now, I think the West doesn't really have much of a choice but to respond to what Putin does. So it's really Putin actually who holds all the cards right now. And the West's response is going to be bound by what he does. And so we have to, so that's what we have to focus on right now. if we think about, who benefits from all this, China benefits hugely from all this. Because what's going to be the post-war reality? The West has imposed very strong economic sanctions on Russia, which means that following the war, Russia is going to be heavily economically dependent on China. So no one is going to have more influence in Moscow than the Chinese government in the coming years. This means Western countries which know this is the situation are going to have to approach China and try to ask China to influence Russia in various spheres. And so China gets to play the new America after this, most probably. China gets to be the big boss who everybody comes to and tries to ask them to weigh in on the situation. So this is a long-term thing, and there are going to be changes in the world, and it's all about how the West deals with that. Right now, Putin is presenting himself as a uniting enemy. And actually, perhaps the West has lacked that for a long time since the Cold War ended. Without that uniting enemy, it's difficult to get people together. Right now, Putin is a credible uniting enemy. And if it becomes clearer, I think, to the Western world that China is also watching all this and is going to try and make its own moves to increase its own power in the world, then I think the West will have pretty much no choice but to have to adapt to that situation.
And just taking a slightly different tack, there's been some commentary about the role that race has played in the West's reaction to the conflict in Ukraine. You tweeted, "We don't expect white people to be bombed and care more when they are." I mean, could you elaborate on this and where you think this race may be a dynamic in how we're reacting to this situation?
I do think we do have to face the reality that majority white societies, like Western societies, do react more when white countries are bombed. That's clear. So now we see there's been a huge reaction to what's going on in Ukraine, and it's been massive simply. And we didn't have that kind of reaction to what was going on in Syria and what was going on in many other parts of the world. There's been a civil war in Ethiopia, Africa's second most populous country, for the past year, really, and thousands of people have died there, and nobody has really noticed that. So that element, that is a reality. That's a reality. People watch, and this is a sort of, it's people like us dying. Okay, that's what the majority white Western audiences see, and we have to. I sort of can understand that from a certain sort of atavistic almost level, but we shouldn't pretend that's not a part of what's going on here.
I mean, do you see that as a smacking of hypocrisy? Maybe. I mean, we have the conflict in Yemen, and one of our closest allies, Saudi Arabia, has been involved in that, and there has been discussions about some things, potentially crimes against humanity or serious human rights violations at the very least happening in China. But the reaction when it comes to Ukraine has been quite strong, quite swift, and where Western leaders have been essentially using this as a way to really assert quite a dominant position on the world stage. Do you think that that should be called out, or as you said, maybe it's just expected and we should accept it?
Hypocrisy is part of foreign policy. And so that, we shouldn't, go about trying to tell people, you can run a moral foreign policy. You can try and have moral elements in your foreign policy, but foreign policy does involve dealing with actors who you may not agree with on anything, pretty much morally, like we have in the situation with Saudi Arabia. So that's one thing. And the second thing, and sorry, I forgot what was the second part of the question?
Well, there's actually just one more question before we go, because we don't have much time. I just wanted to ask you very quickly. I mean, what do you make of some of the arguments what do you think about the arguments that, for example, our fixation with identity politics has meant that we've been shallow over the last few years, and maybe the conflict in Ukraine has woken us up to actually taking much more serious material questions much more seriously? Do you buy that argument at all?
I think a lot of things have made Western societies shallow in the past couple of decades. And generally speaking, societies which are safe and prosperous and have been for a long time do tend to become, shallow and self-indulgent and think they can create this, sort of giant safe space. So a lot of people, I think, thought they could create in Europe, a giant safe space would be immune from all the conflicts of the world, and, bad things would happen elsewhere to other people. Well, right now it's happening here.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Remi Adekoya, politics lecturer at the University of York. Well, coming up, we'll be speaking to a ceramic artist whose talk was cancelled by a prestigious art college. And does the West bear any responsibility for the conflict unfolding in Ukraine? But first, let's take a look at the weather.
Looking ahead to this evening's weather, the UK is looking fine and sunny with a little cloud and rain possible in the west. Let's take a look at the details. Turning cloudier in the southwest this evening, the cloud could be thick enough to bring the odd spot of rain for a time. It'll be breezy, especially along the southern coast. The southeast of England will end the day with continued dry and sunny conditions for all. There'll be a brisk southerly breeze. Increasing amounts of patchy clouds will continue to spread eastwards across southern and western Wales this evening. It'll turn increasingly breezy here too. In contrast, it'll be a fine end to Sunday across all parts of the Midlands. There'll be plenty of sunshine with a rather brisky southerly breeze, feeling quite spring-like. The northeast of England will also end the day dry with plenty of sunshine. There'll be a brisk southerly wind, especially along the coast, and temperatures will dip quickly after sunset. There'll be a west-east split across Scotland this evening with dry and sunny weather for eastern areas and cloudy conditions in the west with a little rain possible. Patchy cloud and sunny spells across Northern Ireland, but thicker cloud and rain also approaching from the west throughout the evening. The winds will increase too. Cloud, rain and stronger winds will edge in from the west overnight, the rain turning heavy at times over western hills. And that's how the weather's shaping up overnight into tomorrow morning.
GB News is the UK's home of discussion and debate
from all perspectives.
To stay up to date on the latest stories,
make sure that you subscribe to the GB News channel
right here on YouTube.
You can watch us live 24/7 across the whole world.
You can also check out exclusive content and catch up on previous episodes of your favourite shows.
Every day, we ask the questions
that you'd ask, so why not add your voice to the conversation in the comments section?
Don't forget to subscribe. We are GB News, Britain's news channel.
Every night at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before.
Basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is
Headliners, the paper review show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon
and Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
My name's Tom Harwood, and every weekday we bring you The Briefing live from 9:30 a.m. The stories, analysis and live debate that you need to hear.
Quite right, Tom, of course.
Was this something that had been considered at all?
Difficult to answer.
Gas-guzzling helicopters circling. Noise is being made here. Joe Biden walking out. Thank you very much for joining us. Don't miss it. The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, Monday to Friday, 9:30 a.m. on GB News.
Join me, Gloria De Piero, Monday to Thursday at noon for The Briefing. We go to the parts of Parliament that you won't see elsewhere. Plus, there's exclusive interviews with MPs from all parties.
But quite often, they paper over the real truth. Why does a working class lad like you join the Tories?
That's a good question.
Don't miss it, Monday to Thursdays at noon on GB News.
Welcome back to the discussion. And just a note that we'll be bringing you more updates from the crisis in Ukraine as they develop throughout this show, but also across the channel today. And today, the Sunday Telegraph reported that ceramic artist Claudia Clare was told that a talk she was due to give at a prestigious art college, Central St Martin's, was no longer welcome because of the threat of protest, which might put the show itself under threat. Claudia Clare had been booked for 2 years to display and discuss her work about women escaping the sex trade at Ceramic Art London, the UK's staple ceramic show. Clare believes that the cancellation of her talk is due to her being outspoken against gender self-identification. Well, Claudia Clare joins me now in the studio to discuss more on this. Thank you so much for joining me this afternoon. First, to just describe to me what happened.
Right, so I was booked 2 years ago, as you said. So I'm going to set the scene because Ceramic Art London, that's organised by the Craft Potters Association, CPA, takes place at Central St Martin's. So it's a kind of three-way thing. I was booked, as you said, to give this talk, which was about a project, it's a joint project with Women at the Well, which is a women-only service, provides support to women in prostitution, also helps them to find ways out. They asked me if I'd make a collection of pots that would illustrate the lives of the women that they work with. So that's the sort of fundamentals. And I was going to give a lecture about that. And then, because whenever I do talk about that, the first question people always ask me is, where can we see the pots? I then asked, particularly since I'm a member of the CPA, I'm a fully paid up selected member, if I could also show some of the pots. And to which, so that was back in 2020, they agreed. And then since then, because of COVID, it's been rolled forward. And then, as far as I knew everything was going fine. And then 9th of February, I got this phone call from Toby Brendan, who's the director of the CPA, telling me that they'd been made aware of a possible threat of disruption, which might cause the fair to be either delayed or possibly even closed. And that for that reason, they were going to have to cancel me. But they have, to this day, they still haven't actually given me a reason.
And so are you certain it's because, I mean, why do you think it was that your talk was cancelled? Are you certain about that? What makes you really think that that was the reason it was cancelled?
Well, it's because, first of all, they completely denied, and they've consistently denied, that it's got anything to do with the subject of the lecture, which is what, reasonably enough, we all thought, I and friends and everybody, we thought it must be that. They've consistently denied that. But they then, for some reason, although the director didn't talk to me, he did talk to a friend of mine called Marshall Coleman, who's a blogger and a ceramicist. And it was he that said, after this briefing with Toby Brendan, that it was because of my gender-critical views.
And, I mean, on that point, because I think this seems to be quite a repeating story. Oftentimes, we saw the situation with Jess DeVos, and we've had other situations as well. Rosie Kay, slightly different.
Rachel Ara, Nina Edge,
I mean, this is shocking, really, that women are being silenced for having views that some people disagree with.
Well, I mean, as Marshall Coleman points out, actually, I wasn't being cancelled because of what I was going to say, because of the lecture, and it wasn't because my work wasn't good enough. It was because of what I think, which, as he said in his blog, is the closest thing to Orwellian thought crime that we've actually seen. I mean, it is incredibly shocking, yes.
One of the things that we covered on this show, the Kate Clancy affair.
Yes.
The
author, yes.
That was essentially cancelled for some of her descriptions of the children that she was having their poetry platformed in the anthology. And similar to this in the way, it is the women
exactly
that you
the thing about shutting this down is whose voices does it close down? Actually, it's those of sex trade survivors and women in prostitution, the most marginalised voices, bar none, that we have in this society. So that's the consequence, irrespective of intention. And, but no one seems to be willing to take any kind of responsibility for that. I should say, actually, they offered me, what they tried to do was sort of bargain with me. Would I do an article in Ceramic Review? Now, that's the sort of in-house magazine of the Craft Potters Association, but it has a wide ceramics audience and it's international. But in order to agree with that, I would have to have accepted that it was OK to give in to these vague threats from whom we still don't really know.
And what can be done about this? Because on GB News, but also within wider society, there's been so many conversations about cancel culture, the silencing, the stifling climate for creatives often that want to question orthodoxies and so on and so forth. What can be done?
It's actually really difficult. I've been thinking about this a lot because I'm taking legal action. Rachel Ara, who was cancelled for exactly the same reason, she wasn't going to be talking about trans or gender issues either. She was simply talking about her work. She was cancelled for the same reason. Nina Edge, the same. You know, these are established status artists, high status artists. And now Rachel Ara also took legal action, and you can win these actions, but the problem is it results really in an individual solution to a collective problem. The thing is that what they're doing isn't actually legal anywhere. There is no law.
Well, your beliefs are protected.
They are,
under the Equality Act. We had the Maya Forstater philosophical belief in relation to gender.
Absolutely.
So actually, in some ways, perhaps they are violating the Equality Act.
Well, exactly. I think that's why one of the reasons I'm taking the case.
But isn't it frustrating that we have to have a legalistic response?
Oh, God. I mean, it's infuriating. And the problem is this culture has been developing and hardening and becoming increasingly rigid in the arts since the early 2000s. You know, that's when it started. Some people say the arts have been captured. I would say I'm not sure they were. I think they actually welcomed this in. I see it as an attack on free speech. And it's also... It's being used to protect misogyny, which seems to be the impetus behind all this.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your experience, Claudia Clare, ceramics artist and feminist.
You're very welcome.
And we will be bringing you more stories about many artists and creators and individuals that are really unjustly being cancelled and silenced for many of their views. Anyway, coming up, does the West bear any responsibility for the conflict unfolding in Ukraine? Is liberal interventionism over? But first, let's get the latest headlines.
It's 3:33. I'm Rhiannon Jones in the GB newsroom. Talks between Ukraine and Russia are about to start as the Russian Foreign Ministry says the two sides are arriving at the meeting point. President Zelensky's office confirmed earlier that the talks are taking place on the border between Belarus and Ukraine and that both delegations are meeting without preconditions. Ukraine's foreign minister says Belarus has given assurance that it won't get involved in the war during the talks. President Putin's order to raise nuclear deterrent forces to high alert is dangerous rhetoric and irresponsible behaviour. That's according to NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg. The White House says it's part of Moscow's pattern of manufacturing threats. Kharkiv's governor says Ukraine is still in full control of its second largest city after Russian forces entered early this morning. Intensive rocket artillery exchanges overnight had been followed by heavy fighting in the area. That as Ukraine's president says his forces have held off Russian troops advancing on the capital. The mayor of Kiev also confirmed there are no Russian troops in his city. Vitaly Klitschko said that in total 31 people have died in the capital since the attack started, including 9 civilians, while 106 people have been injured. 368,000 Ukrainians have already fled for Poland, Moldova and other neighbouring countries. The United Nations is warning the number could grow to 4 million if fighting escalates further. Prime Minister Boris Johnson's confirmed the UK will take refugees fleeing the war. TV online and DAB Plus radio, you're up to date, but plenty more on the news at the top of the hour. But it's back to Inaya and the discussion in just a moment.
GB News is the UK's home of discussion and debate
from all perspectives.
To stay up to date on the latest stories,
make sure that you subscribe to the GB News channel
right here on YouTube.
You can watch us live 24/7 across the whole world.
You can also check out exclusive content and catch up on previous episodes of your favourite shows.
Every day, we ask the questions
that you'd ask, so why not add your voice to the conversation in the comments section?
Don't forget to subscribe. We are GB News, Britain's news channel.
Every night at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before.
It's basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is
Headliners, the paper review show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon.
And Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
In Ukraine, Russian troops continue their push towards Kiev. The combat began early on February 24th when Vladimir Putin, Russia's president, announced a special military operation to demilitarize Ukraine, thereby bringing large-scale war back to Europe. Putin's decision has sparked horror within Western countries, with sanctions against Russia announced in response, and even calls for military intervention to be taken by the West to defend Ukraine. But others have made the point that Putin's behaviour is actually defensive and not an offensive strategy. Russia is reacting to Western political and military manoeuvring on the border, it is argued. The invasion of Ukraine might have been motivated by NATO's dismissal of his request not to make Ukraine and Georgia NATO members. So did the West play a role in stirring tensions in Eastern Europe? Are we doing enough to de-escalate the conflict? And considering the pitfalls of liberalism plaguing Western democracy, is liberal interventionism warranted at all? Well, I am joined now by Tim Black, columnist at Spiked Online. Thank you so much for joining me this afternoon, Tim. Firstly, what do you make of what's happening in Ukraine, and who bears responsibility for the crisis unfolding there right now?
Well, actually, to answer the second question first, who bears responsibility for the invasion of Ukraine? It's quite clearly Vladimir Putin and the Russian state. They took a decision, it seems, in the past week to violate the sovereignty of another country, to override the democratic will of the people of Ukraine. And it's an utterly despicable decision. And as I say, the only person and the only body of people you can hold responsible for that are those at the Kremlin. The broader question, though, is Vladimir Putin didn't make this decision on a whim. He didn't make this. He didn't come to this conclusion, just the other week. In some ways, there's a set of steps which have led up to this situation, which have created a geopolitical context, an antagonistic geopolitical context, in which Vladimir Putin felt justified, unfortunately, in making this decision. And for that, in some ways, we can blame Western powers for making a series of strategic mistakes over decades and fueling tensions between the West and Russia. In particular, I think much of the blame must be attached to NATO expansionism, which, of course, Putin himself has picked out as one of the principal causes for his actions, certainly over the past decade, annexing Crimea, interventions in Georgia in 2008, and so on. And the problem is that basically since the 1990s, NATO has expanded ever closer to the Russian border. This is a Cold War military institution that's lasted after the Cold War. It took in a set of old Warsaw Pact countries in the late 90s. It then took in the Baltic states in the mid-noughties. And then in 2008, NATO announced that the door was open to Ukraine, which is Russia's neighbour, which shares such long historical and familial links with Russia. And that was seen as a step too far for Russia. It would effectively have meant that you would have a Western, US-led military presence on the border with Russia. So there's no doubt where the responsibility lies for the invasion of Ukraine, and it is a despicable act. But the situation has been contributed to, I think, by the kind of the inflammatory actions, not necessarily out of malevolence, but the inflammatory actions of Western powers who've kind of acted complacently and with very little sort of diplomatic nous.
And it does seem that the talking up of the conflict or the escalation is increasing. We've heard announcements that selective Russian banks, for example, will be excluded from the SWIFT international banking system. Ursula von der Leyen tweeted that she will paralyze the assets of the Russian central bank. This will freeze its transactions, and it will be impossible for the central bank to liquidate assets. And it has been said that this will have very significant and far-reaching effects on the Russian economy. And so do you think that we are now, with the conflict in front of us, de-escalating it and acting diplomatically in a way that would actually ease tensions? Or is there still a mindset that we need to talk hard and talk up the conflict?
I think Europe, the US at the moment can do little but I think respond rhetorically with a certain degree of aggression towards Russia. And I also think that in some ways it's almost to entirely be expected that they've responded with a set of economic sanctions and of course the removal of certain Russian banks from the SWIFT financial payment system. But thus far, I think what we've seen, and this is a good thing, that the West is refraining from doing anything that looks like a military move against Russia. In terms of whether they can seek to find some diplomatic solution, at the moment they're kind of held back by the rhetoric. You know, you can't sort of big up and hype up Russia and Putin as something like the Nazis redux and then expect to enter a negotiation. You can't negotiate with Nazis. And for as long as you sort of portray Putin and the Russians as almost like an entirely irrational actor, then it does make negotiations very difficult.
In danger of reviving a kind of Cold War mindset. I mean, some observers have commented that actually since the fall of the Soviet Union, Russia has attempted to, for example, engage the West, that there were calls in Russia to join NATO at one point, which would surprise many. And you wrote an article in Spike talking about the peace that could have been. Do you think there has been a missed opportunity over the last couple of decades to forge better relations, but perhaps we've been stuck in a different mindset when it comes to Russia?
What's happening right now is a catastrophe, but it is also a bit of a tragedy as well, because it does look as if there were chances to bring Russia into the fold after the end of the Cold War. So there were decisions taken which meant that didn't happen. So it does lend this whole conflict a tragic aspect. Throughout the 1990s, Russia at points was talking about possible NATO membership. It certainly was always resistant to any NATO expansion. And right at the start of the end of the Cold War, there was even talk of possibly disbanding NATO once you disbanded the Warsaw Pact. So there was an opportunity, I think, for almost a complete reset of relations, stepping out of the old Cold War framework. But unfortunately, there were too many in positions of power and influence who were determined in some ways to think in terms of the new post-Cold War order, almost in terms of the old Cold War antagonisms. So that it meant that NATO persisted, and it meant that Russia's concerns were ignored. And there were still various opportunities, I think, for a reset of relationships. Even at the beginning of the noughties, when Vladimir Putin has succeeded Boris Yeltsin, Vladimir Putin himself was even talking about possibly joining NATO. So there were chances missed, I think, for some kind of reconciliation and for a way of sort of going beyond and transcending these kind of binary oppositions between West and East, between Western Europe and Eastern Europe, and Western Europe, unfortunately, now, and Russia. And those chances were missed. So it does lend the whole catastrophe a kind of tragic aspect.
And going forward, I mean, what do you make of the changing role of the West? We talk about the rise of China within society now, and this conflict may well potentially push Russia closer to China. And so shifting the balance of power internationally away from Western dominance. I mean, do you welcome that, or do you see that as a worrying shift within the international order?
Do you know what? It's not a matter of sort of welcoming or disapproving of that shift. The shift is happening. In some ways, the invasion of Ukraine, I don't think, could have happened without a weakening of the West and a weakening of the Western alliance, which we've certainly seen over the past 10 years or so. In terms of a new world order in which Russia and China are sort of united as one, that relationship between Russia and China is a very fragile one. Like, already we've seen China, in the past 48 hours, distance itself ever so slightly from Russia when it refused to vote in the UN on whether the UN should deplore Russia's actions. So already at a diplomatic level, China is desperate to sort of distance itself from Russian aggression. And there's nothing that's in China's conflict in Europe is simply not in China's interests. So the extent to which we're seeing a new world order with China and Russia to the fore, that's not as clear as one might think. I think what we're seeing at the moment, rather, is almost like the disintegration of that old post-Cold War order, where the West was dominant, say, for about 10 to 20 years.
Well, thank you so much for joining me this afternoon, Tim Black, columnist at Spiked Online. I'm now also joined in the studio by Chris Newton, military historian and defence analyst. Thank you so much for joining me this afternoon, Chris. I mean, I just want to start. You wrote an article in The Critic that said liberal complacency has left us unprepared to face the crisis in Ukraine. Could you just elaborate on that argument?
Yes, effectively, going from the previous guest, the West, we won we had the end of the Cold War. The West was triumphant, and we were in this kind of status of, conventional warfare major conventional warfare is not going to be, coming back.
Yeah.
Liberalism has triumphed.
Yeah. But I'm just going to have to butt in for a second. We have a bit of a problem with your mic. We're going to sort that out just in a moment. I think it is really important, some of the things that Tim Black was saying there, because I think that we are in danger as a society of creating a very kind of binary worldview when it comes to international conflicts. It's, Russia, bad and evil, and undoubtedly what's gone on in Ukraine is absolutely horrendous. But we have to, if we are to prevent conflict and restore peace within Europe, understand the interests and reasons and the historical and cultural background and conditions which made something like this possible and likely, and therefore understanding it from a wide range of perspectives is really important. And hopefully we've now sorted out Chris's mic. Could you just go back to jump in what you were saying?
Yes, so essentially liberalism has triumphed. We're only going to fight counterinsurgencies, wars among the people and so forth. And therefore it's, we didn't contemplate kind of the rise of Russia, and we kind of misread Russia as well. We assumed that Russia was thinking like a liberal, Russia's democracy now. So
is this very similar to the kind of Francis Fukuyama thesis that, the end of history and then, liberalism has triumphed, and that, and in many ways that has been, really challenged in so many multifaceted ways. I mean, but do you think liberalism can be saved? I mean, many people argue that the way in which we exited from Afghanistan revealed that liberal interventionism is dead, and actually a series of disastrous failed wars effectively have really called into question whether or not that is the right approach. And actually many Western societies, Joe Biden's America, are seeing their role as much more one of retreat. I mean, do you really think that we should be reviving a kind of liberal worldview when it comes to international conflicts?
Yeah, I mean, we're definitely in having a kind of a self-crisis at the moment on a number of levels. You know, the disaster from Afghanistan, and also an internal crisis, you know, in terms of our own values as well. Looking at history, I mean, we had a kind of a crisis. We had a crisis at the end of the Vietnam Wars, the US, again, kind of retrenching. And then during the course of the 1980s, we had a revival, we had a renewed confidence. And then that, you know, led into the 1990s with interventions, for example, in the Gulf War and so forth. So it's possible that, you know, we could regain our sense of confidence again and conduct interventions, but we will be restricted in, you know, in terms of this new world with China and Russia and so forth.
I just want to signpost that we are now seeing the Romanian border and many people trying to pass through there. And I think we've just got some images and videos on your screen right now. I mean, going forward, I mean, do you think that this has really woken up Western societies? I mean, we've just had Germany announce that they're going to be spending more than 2% of GDP on defence. But some people are saying that actually when Trump was in power, for example, he was arguing that they should be paying their way, and they were sceptical of that and reluctant to do that. Do you think this has been a wake-up call, so to speak, about the importance of bolstering your military defences in the event, unfortunately, where conflict may well ensue?
Yes. I mean, I hope so, at least. I mean, going back to my article, I mean, we have been complacent. We've slashed defence in the UK. You know, at the end of the Cold War, it's around 4% of GDP. Now it's hovering around 2%. And I'm hoping, I mean, the German announcement is a good sign. However, 2% still low. As I said, in the UK's level was about 4%. And where's our announcements? I would expect, you know, at some point in the next few weeks, the government to announce, right, we're in a new situation now. We need a new agenda. And we really need to look at defence again. We need to look at the integrated review, the defence part of that. And we need to reconsider, although there has been some degree of increases in defence, we do need to consider some of the cuts that we've made, for example, or we're making, for example, in tanks. Now we're seeing tank battles in Europe.
Why have we got this so wrong? Conversations about energy security have been going on for decades. Conversations about Russian money within the British system have been going on for decades. I mean, it just seems that people have been immature, perhaps politicians, in actually taking these problems seriously. Because we've even had, even the last few years, discussions about Chinese involvement in Huawei and our strategic infrastructure. There does seem to be, we had 2014, the annexation of Crimea. I mean, why have there not been an awareness, an awakening of what has been really a long-standing problem?
Because we have been complacent. We have, we think that we didn't need to confront these things anymore. We thought that we were exempt from history and that these things don't happen to us. And yet we've just had a pandemic, and now we've got this to confront, and we are still affected by these things and by history. We're not exempt from it.
Well, thank you so much. That was military historian and defence analyst. Thank you so much for joining us on the programme. Well, that's all from us on the discussion. Big discussions, big stories. See you at the same time next week. But up next is Nana Queer. Thank you.
Looking ahead to this evening's weather, the UK is looking fine and sunny with a little cloud and rain possible in the west. Let's take a look at the details. Turning cloudier in the southwest this evening. The cloud could be thick enough to bring the odd spot of rain for a time. It'll be breezy, especially along southern coast. The southeast of England